All right, well, hello everyone. I've got Deb, the omnivorous reader, with me once again. I'm sure people have seen Deb on the channel, and hopefully you go check out her channel. It was about a month or so ago, we read Ringworld together, and we had a
Last
blast
month, I
with
think.
that. And Deb's in Australia. They've had a cyclone. The internet's a little spotty, so we're gonna bear with us on this one. We're going to hope the connection stays stable, but we should be good. So today we are going to talk about this book, Half Past Human by TJ Bass. Oh, you got the Masterworks edition.
I tried to get one of the old ones in the wild, but I couldn't find them, and it was Masterworks or nothing. But I am quite happy with this copy.
Yeah, and this was a book that went straight to paperback, and I don't think it ever had a hardback edition. It was copyright 1971, but there was a couple stories that were published in Astounding before that, and then TJ Bass kind of turned this into a novel. And I was kind of turned on to this. I had the books, but I saw Deb had done a review on the sequel, I guess loosely based sequel, God Whale. And I haven't watched that yet because I'm going to read that next because I have a copy. But I've always been curious about this book, so we decided to do a buddy read on it, and I think we both really enjoyed it. We're going to keep this video kind of spoiler free, maybe spoiler light. It is kind of a book more about some of the world building and stuff like that. So we won't really spoil some of the things that happen at the end of the plot in case you want to give this one a read. So I guess we'll just start off. What was your kind of overall impression on this one, Deb?
I really enjoyed it. It's very densely written. There's a lot of information there. And I would say the storytelling is atypical to what we see. Certainly not what you'd see in a modern book, but not really typical for what you see in a lot of classic science fiction either. Um, the narrative sort of rolls and the information is really dense because TJ Bass was actually a surgeon and he uses biological science descriptions that I don't think everyone's going to understand. Now, I know your background is engineering. I'm actually really interested to hear how many of these descriptions you had to Google.
There's more. I Googled more words in this book than any other book. And what was amazing is they were used such like in the perfect context in a way. And I started kind of
But they,
trying to guess what the word meant, and then I'd look it up, and it was usually pretty close. You could kind of read the context around the sentence and kind of sort of understand where he was getting.
he does that in the God Whale as well. So I guess I was prepared for it. I was reading this partly during the cyclone, so I had no internet and I couldn't Google words, and that made me really aware of how difficult it would have been to read when it was first published. So there was one particular one that I actually wrote down on page 20: fibrin and erythrocyte crust and cover edematous laceration, which is a very complicated way of saying the wound got a scab. So
Yeah, there was a lot of like anatomy and things like that, and he put it in the characters' minds too, which that was I overall really like this book, but it kind of made me think like, is everyone in this world a doctor? Because if that's some of the thoughts they're having, you know.
and I don't have a lot of complaint with the way he wrote it because I don't think he was trying to be a realistic or necessarily believable in some ways. But I mean, this is probably getting ahead of ourselves. But most of the characters are nebbishes and they have been evolved in the hive to be very short lived. So at one point, he says a 27-year-old is actually quite old. And they don't get, doesn't sound like they get a lot of education, and they certainly don't get enough nutrition. So having one of these nebbishes holding forth about how the spinal cord works is a little bit odd because your average, I don't know, 19 or 20-year-old who's never been to school is unlikely to be able to describe the spinal cord, I feel. So, yeah,
Yeah, and I felt this.
enjoyable, but its own special thing.
Yeah, I felt the same way because there is. Yeah, I think getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but there was one character who was sort of a doctor slash engineer, and it sounded very natural coming out of his mind, all of these medical terminologies and anatomy, but it was kind of in everyone's internal monologue. And it was fascinating. I liked that part. I could see how maybe some people wouldn't like the language, but I actually really enjoyed that part of it because it was just so unique, the writing. So
So,
yeah,
do you want to give a bit of description of what the actual plot is about?
well first let's do a little world building here because I think that's where he really excels. And in the beginning of the book, they mention in the very first sentence, they mention like a year of 2349, but it seems like we're much further in the future. Did you get the same impression?
So, my first sentence is in the year of Olga 2349.
Yeah, so
So, Olga is this theory throughout the book. But if it's so, since Olga, we've had 2349, but somewhere else in the book, it mentions something that happens long before this as being thousands of years in the future of us here. So
so yeah, that makes a
I
lot more
think he
sense.
intentionally leaves it mysterious.
Yeah, they reset the date at some point. And so we're like thousands of years in the future. And humanity has kind of evolved into this four-toed uh, creature that's fairly they sound fairly humanoid. Their blood's a little thinner. They don't have the pigmentation in their skin, so they've been living underground and there's 3 trillion people or yeah, I guess we could still call them humans or half
Yeah,
past human.
literally.
So there's 3 trillion humans living subterraneously on the planet. And the whole surface of the planet is almost like a bacterial soup where they harvest algae and all kinds of different things that make up their caloric intake. And it's all done kind of through automation, mostly with machines. So most of all the population on the planet are these Nebish, and there are a few five-toed humans that are still around, and they're kind of not really encouraged, and they've kind of been bred out of society. And this society is kind of a mixture of cloning and genetic mutations and selective breeding. It's very odd. But some of the humans that have 5 toes and are more of what we think of, they kind of have a yearning to go up onto the surface of the earth. And there's a few of them up there kind of doing their thing, trying to live a more natural life, and they're being hunted by some of these Nebish hunters that go out and to protect their like algae farms and whatnot.
I'll add some to that. It's not particularly obvious because TJ Bass doesn't really spell things out for us in any regard in this book. But having read the next book, I can see the hints where it's clear that the hive is actually an intelligence and it is intentionally modifying the Nebushes to be what it wants it to be. So, yeah, they've got 4 toes. Their bones are much lighter. They are provided with basic calories, but those basic calories aren't really enough to let them evolve into what we would consider human. Now, because they've been intentionally genetically manipulated and cloned and intentionally created this perfect hive citizen, we find out that the gene for the 5 toes hasn't been eliminated from the population. It will still crop up naturally. People are allowed to breed naturally, as happens later in the book. And at some point, I think it says there's 1 million what we would consider humans on the surface. And also the Nebushes make the distinction between themselves, the four-toed, and the others, the five-toed, and they try to characterize them as being animals in their own head. I'd add that
Yeah, yeah,
without spoilers.
yeah. And the even the Nebbish, like they they're kind of neutered is what they call them, a neuter. And if they get kind of selected to breed, they get polarized, which kind of sends them male or female. I don't know if that's predetermined or if that's just something that happens when they're polarized. And then they're allowed to breed, like you mentioned. And it's a very dystopian, not for the faint of heart world. It's very grim down there with so many lives. You know, they don't take life that serious. You can throw babies away, and there's disease, and there's all these other things going on. It's not a very nice sounding place that he describes.
My introduction, I've never heard of this guy, but he talks a lot about how TJ Bass was writing from the era where things like Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring were bringing up environmental issues as a big, big thing. And my introduction is suggesting that that's what TJ Bass was all about in these two books, that he was describing a complete dystopia of a world. And it does come across to the reader as a pretty horrific world. It's not always consistent. It's not always easy to understand what he's getting at, but yeah, it sounds horrific. Is it a spoiler to say that there's only one real source of protein in this world because we've exterminated all other species?
No, I don't think so. That's where I was going to go, that you know, these 3 trillion are the mainly the only life form left on the planet. There's really no animals, birds, fish. There's a few rats. And then on the surface of the planet, they are, you know, growing food in a way, but it doesn't seem to be enough. So everything gets recycled back into the circle of life. And it's interesting because in the beginning, they're kind of making fun or talking down to some of the traditional humans for resorting to cannibalism, these humans that are living on the surface. But you find out, it doesn't take very long to find out that all of the Nebish down underneath the world are doing the same thing, basically.
And it's interesting how we've got this complete callousness to unwanted babies being disposed of, and any adult who's old or sick also goes into, I think they call them patty mills at one stage. But it's, and you've got suicides on a regular basis. So you've got all these really horrific dystopian ideas, but Bass springs them on you slowly and so organically that by the time you've had the cannibalism spelled out for you, it's like you've accepted it already.
Yeah.
So he does that. And at the same time, you've got these citizens of the hive who are empathetic and horrified by bad things happening. And it's a little bit hard for me to figure out how he was trying to get these two things to work. Either you can throw anyone down the chute to the patty machine, or you can be empathetic about someone who is sick and probably dying. And I guess that does address humanity in a way because we do have that strange high empathy yet callousness toward things around us, but it's very confrontational at times for the reader, I think.
Yeah, because I think a lot of us, if you don't see something happen, it doesn't seem as bad. Stuff's happening all over the place for these Nebish. It's not a very nice place to be. The other thing I think we should talk about is the tech in this one, because he's got some really interesting tech. There's like these harvesters that are on the surface of the planet, and they have like their own personalities, and they kind of try to stay out of the conflict between the Nebish and the humans, and they just have a job to do. They can be talked into certain things. It's very interesting. And then the I'll mention this too, and then get your thoughts. one of the coolest things that I've read in science fiction for a while, or what I thought it was pretty cool, was this character named Toothpick. And it was just like a little wand, a little pick, and we were introduced to him in the very first chapter. The first chapter is titled after the toothpick and two other characters. And it's just this AI that can do all these things. It can interact with the tech and get people through doors. It can send out light beams and mess with people's senses. And it's kind of becomes our guide for some of our humans along the way. And it was just a really fascinating character.
Toothpick's fascinating. And I love the way he never uses the word AI. I suspect it wasn't around when he was writing, but virtually the hive itself, and then virtually every mechanism from the harvesters to toothpick to a few other things, they are virtually all AIs. But toothpick is particularly fascinating because all the other ones are plugged into the general mind, which is um, the hive, and they're controlled by their protocols. Whereas Toothpick tells us that he's so old that he's been disconnected. He tells us that early on, so that's not a spoiler. And he does. He guides the first two characters, Old Moon and his dog Dan, apparently the last dog on Earth. Um, and then when he's done with them, he moves on to someone else. So about two-thirds through, I started thinking, really, our main protagonist here is Toothpick. And Toothpick's obviously got his own mission and story arc, and the humans and everything else along the way are just coincidental to what he's trying to get to. And
Yep.
we're never told that, but it started to feel that way.
Yeah, I had the same exact thoughts because the other thing that I would say, the characters aren't completely fleshed out in this book from 1971, which isn't uncommon. And there we get introduced to many different characters, both humans and Nebish, and he kind of gets you to sympathize with both sides pretty well, but they're never characters that I was that upset if something happened to them. It was never like fleshed out that much, but I did start getting like an attachment to this little toothpick character.
Um, yeah, and they were very much rolling characters. After a while, I stopped remarking on it, but we started with Old Moon and his dog Dan, and then we moved on to Tinker. Is you mentioned him briefly earlier. He's he starts off as being an actual tinker, a mechanic who takes care of the ships, who take the hunters outside and the mechs, and he's got all this amazing tech skill, which is really amazing. But later he becomes a kind of doctor as well. The two don't really mesh in my mind, but they obviously do in TJ Bass's. So we've got Old Moon and Dan, and then we revolve into Tinker, and then when Tinker's well on the way of his storyline, then we get Moses Eppendorf, I think his surname was. So we just have this continual rolling character C. And in a way, I think that's just what Bass does, because in the God Whale, you've got a couple of characters that last throughout, but he isn't really interested in sticking to an individual character. He's just allowing the characters to take his story forward.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that was kind of typical, especially when they took short stories and made fix-up novels. You would get bits and pieces of these characters, and in this one, some characters go away, sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. Even after the midway point through the book, you're still getting introduced to a few new characters along the way. So if you're really,
Yeah,
if you have to have like a character-driven story, this one might let you down a little bit. But if you're into the world building and where he sees a runaway kind of monoculture society, I guess you would call it, this is a pretty interesting look at that.
definitely if you need a sympathetic character to relate to, TJ Bass might not be for you because even Toothpick, my favorite character, isn't actually that likable in some regards. No spoilers, but he does some pretty horrible things. I think these books are also not for someone who wants everything explained because Bass isn't even trying to explain everything. He's leaving a lot up in the air. I've heard some people criticize William Gibson's books because he gives you slang, and Tanner Flee too. They give you slang without explaining it. And I think Bass does that as well. A lot of the words you learn what they mean from context over time, but a lot of them are just basically invented words. Yes, so you've got a density of experience and stuff happening, but not as big on character, I think. Well, not
Yeah,
traditional characters, at least.
right. And but he put so much attention to detail, like even like how there's like a group of these Nebish who feel this need to go back and they're into dab. Do you remember this? It's dirt,
Oh, the
adobo.
dabblers,
Yeah, dirt, adobo, and bamboo.
bamboo.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and they'll like take a little portion of their apartment and put dirt down and put their feet in it and grow bamboo and they're kind of like they're yearning for something more than this life is giving them. And I think he makes this a very fascinating world for sure. And he puts a lot of
Yes.
little nuance and little ideas everywhere.
And Olga is one because, again, no spoilers, but Olga is this um, mythos that travels with us both outside with the 5 foot, what we'd recognize as humans, they call savages. Um, but you've got this religious, pagan type Olga worship. And yet we find inside the hive through Walter, who's also the dabbler, that you've got this whole number of people inside who are Nebishes who think of Olga in your traditional, I guess, religious overtone. When Olga comes again, everything will be fine, that sort of a thing.
Yeah,
And again, doesn't over explain, it's just there.
it's just there. And even the hive, you don't get a glimpse of what the leaders are, or if there are leaders. You're just introduced to some of the citizens in this world, and some of them have some play some pretty key parts, but there's a lot left to the imagination of how this thing is organized and who's behind it, really.
I will say that if you're looking out for it, at the end of Half Past Human, you get a pretty foreshadowing notion of how the hive operates. Throughout, you don't really know. The hive obviously has its own goals and its own intelligence, but toward the end, I think if you're looking out for it, you will see that the hive is governed by a collection of minds, and it is in all intents and purposes, an AI or an intelligence of its own. And you see that because at the end, you've got a huge big thing happens at the end, and someone that's Val is trying to contact the hive mind to get an approval, but he can't get through to the first level, and he's told they've been knocked out, and now the second level is going to be taking the first level's place. So you've clearly got this hierarchy of minds, and it does kind of suggest to you that they aren't really human minds per se, and as such.
Hmm.
I might not have picked that up if I hadn't done the strange thing of reading number two before I read number one. But I will say that the two books really don't need to be read in sequence. They are each of them so very individual that it doesn't matter all that much.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm definitely curious. I'm definitely
And
gonna
please don't watch my review of The God Whale. It was terrible.
I'll watch it after I finish the book, but um yeah, and we really didn't get much into the plot, but there's a there's people who want to go up to the surface and they're being hunted, and so they're running from these hunters, and there's this kind of background of like this religious thing you were talking about, this Olga. You don't really know what's going on there, and you have all this AI, it's a pretty dense story. It does take you many places over the planet. You get out into the ocean for a bit. And it does have a pretty big sort of reveal at the end that we're not going to spoil. It kind of makes it makes it a little bit more than just world building to me. and gave it a little bit more meaning and a pretty cool idea at the end. So overall, I enjoyed this one. It was just so unique from I think anything I've ever really read.
I'd agree. I think it's a bit of a shame he only ever wrote those two books and I think seven stories in total, because his writing isn't really like anything I've ever read before either. It's quite unique. Can we talk about the hunters a little bit?
Yeah.
So, hunters are a big part of the novel, and I but there's actually two types. The most noticeable one are ones like Val, where you'd have these series of ships, like Bird Dog is one of them that I remember. And they take hunters outside, and the hunters are nebbishes that are specifically suited up and filled full of drugs, like apparently speed. Apparently, speed was around in the 70s too. And they go out and they hunt the 5-footed animals and they take trophies, which I won't spoil it. Um, and we see a lot of that because when Hive citizens go outside, they're chased by hunters, but the hunters are primarily there to protect the crops because the 5-footers don't have a lot of food. They have to steal from the Hive crops in order to live. And so when they do that, they're detected by the Hive, who sends out hunters. And the hunting is actually a bit of a holiday or a treat for people who've done especially well by the Hive. But also in chapter 4, Val, who is kind of our ongoing protagonist throughout, and he's a bit of a bad guy. He was Tinker's boss, but then he hunts him. Anyway, Val goes on a different kind of a hunt. He's gone rat hunting, and you see him suit up, and he goes through all these tubes to this other part of the world, under the sea, over the sea, I don't know, to go hunting these rats, which are doing fine apparently. And that is chapter 4. And you've got some of the best evidence there that the city is sentient in its own right, because it's communicating with Val and talking as another individual will in order to guide him to the best of the rat nests. So, anything you would like to say about the hunting scenarios?
Yeah, that was a pretty gruesome thing. They make little patties, little pucks out of those rats, and it's like a delicacy. And he goes and shares them with his closest friends. Um, and yeah, the hunting is interesting because you have some five-toed humans on the surface, and they're kind of always playing this cat and mouse game. They can't carry anything that's metal. So they've kind of gone back to primitive tools. There's a alternative cover for the Ballantine edition, the second printing, and it has kind of like these cavemen on it. I don't know if you've seen it. And that's
I
kind of what I
haven't, no.
envisioned. Yeah, you have to look it up. And and then so you have these hunters with this, this high tech these ships, but then they're using bow and arrows to try to take these humans out. And this is kind of a constant uh, plot device used. There's always this thing going on between the humans on the surface and the hunters trying to take care of them. And the other thing I will add, there's this really cool chapter about if you do something well, you get rewarded to be able to go climbing, I think is what they called it. And you're not sure what this means at all. And also these nebbish, when they go outside, they'll go outside to kill themselves because they can't handle the rays of the sun and they don't last very long unless they slowly build themselves up. But one of these rewards, you get to go outside and do a bit of a climbing event, which was really interesting part of the novel, I thought.
Yes, I really enjoyed that part as well. And I don't think we should go into that because it could easily become a spoiler. But again, I love the description of how far you had to travel through all these tubes for days in order to get to a place where there was still climbing. And You really get a sense of the whole world, which is one big hive linked underground by these tubes, and the entire surface is just. I envisaged it actually as one of those areas that is just pure agriculture. For you guys, I think that'd be corn, but for us, it's often cane fields. So just field after field with little towers overseeing the whole thing, and nothing alive other than the crop itself.
Yeah.
But when it might have been Val. No, I can't remember who. Someone went to that climbing episode. He talks about, I think that was when he talks about traveling further and further north until there aren't any more crops. And instead, you've just got these towers full of algae that have to be completely supplied with all their sunlight and all their warmth.
Hmm.
So, yeah, it's a very dystopian landscape that we get.
Yeah, and they even that he describes the landscape really good, and he talks about this like agrofoam that sweeps in over an area and like provides nutrients, and it's all like done through these automated AI vehicles. Some of the world building around the surface is was really fascinating to me.
Mm. It was so well done and so well complex. And I don't know if you noticed, but another thing about that foam, especially towards the end when we're gearing up, apparently TJ Bass likes having one big battle, the hive against everyone else, because there's one in each book. But toward the end, when he's talking about that foam that's being laid down by the mechs, apparently it's got a lot of chemicals in it which are molecular disruptors or hormones, I can't remember, that basically kill all insect life, which is why there's no insects on the surface. And I thought that was a very nice environmental touch as well, because that's essentially what a lot of the large pesticide companies do. They introduce a chemical that makes a bug's gut explode. Um, and in this book, the protagonist in that section is hypothesizing about what repeated exposure to this hormone would do to the humans who come in contact with it. And I think TJ Bass managed to just slip a little bit of a social commentary in there.
All right, well, anything else you want to mention about this one? Who would you recommend this to, I
Oh, I
guess?
could talk about it for so long. Anyone who is interested in biological sciences, and there's a niche lot of us out there who love classic science fiction fantasy, but really get enthusiastic when you've got strong bioscience instead of the strong physics or engineering. Maybe for them, these two are absolutely worthwhile. Anyone who's fascinated by unusual dystopias, complex writing, who would you say it's designed for?
Yeah, I agree with all that. And there's been some different types of science fiction I didn't even know existed, like anthropological science fiction that I love now. I didn't really even know that was a thing when I was a kid. And I think this is another kind of weird niche where I I I think it's great. It is challenging for someone who doesn't know a lot about biology. But some of us, there's people who are looking for a challenge, and you might not get it with a complex, crazy plot, but you get it with his descriptive writing and his prose and all of that. And um, I think it works because it does still paint a picture, a really vivid picture of this world to you. So just be prepared to look up some words, take your time. I think if you do spend a little time looking up the words and their definitions, I think you'll enjoy it a little bit more than otherwise you'll just get annoyed by it and you should probably give up, you know.
Yeah. Honestly, I'm not sure that there's anyone out there that won't have to look up words. I think TJ Bass, as a surgeon, probably became fascinated by things and thought, hey, there's not enough attention given to them, so he put them in here. But I think probably most doctors would have to look up some of those as well. And some
Yeah.
of them are outmoded now. So some of them are sort of past their day. Um, did you, Ira, did you look up the short stories he has?
Well, I saw the reference to him here. I didn't know if he wrote anything that didn't get turned into a book.
I think maybe he did. So apparently he had 7 short stories in total. Um, and the first one that I see mentioned is Star Itch from 1968. That doesn't seem to be in either of the two novels I read.
Hmm.
It's about the whole Olga business. Then we've got Star Seeker from 69. I went into this, you can tell. I'm not sure
Okay.
about that one. You've got Half Past Human, which is actually pretty much the first chapter of this, as far as I can tell. That was from 71. You've got Guitar or Song of Kaya, and
Which we
that's
didn't even
also,
mention guitar.
we never mentioned guitar. There's so much. We never mentioned ball either.
Yeah, we haven't mentioned a
So
lot in
much.
here.
Um, Game of Biochess, 1970. That one sounds like it's 100% science fiction, so I don't think it's even on the Earth. Um, there's The Beast of 309. Again, science fiction. I don't think it actually relates except peripherally to these two. And then there's finally Rockall Maru, 1972, which was published in Galaxy. And I think that became Godwale. But there's the Internet Archive.org seems to have all those short stories available in their magazine form for anyone who'd like to read them.
That's really good to know. I was
So
gonna either look through my anthologies or Internet Archive is a great way to pull up if they have a scan of the magazine you're looking for, and you get to see all the old ads and pictures and everything that was included. Well, thanks for doing this read along. This was a real fun one, and it's a good one to discuss with someone, I think, too, because of how unique it was. So, um,
thank you for putting up with my post cyclone internet and my being out of communication for a week or so and everything. And thanks for doing the editing as always.
yep, no problem. Look forward to doing another video again with you, Deb.
Yes, very much.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.